You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I was building storage shelves for my daughter's garage, right next to her furnace room, and she asked me to treat the wood with fire retardant. Reasonable request. So I went to the hardware store, picked up a commercial fire retardant spray, and the second I started reading the back of that can, I stopped. Formaldehyde derivatives, ammonium phosphate compounds, a warning label longer than my arm telling me not to breathe it, not to touch it, and to ventilate for 48 hours. And I thought, there has to be a better way. People have been building with wood for thousands of years, and they did not have chemical plants. Turns out, the answer was sitting in 300 years of naval history, and almost nobody in modern woodworking talks about it. The men who built wooden warships, vessels that had to survive cannon fire, flaming arrows, and fire ships packed with pitch and gunpowder, they figured out how to make wood resist fire, using nothing more than minerals you can buy at the grocery store. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how they did it, method by method, so you can use these same treatments in your own shop. And stick around to the end, because I will show you a simple test I learned for knowing whether your treatment has actually penetrated deep enough to work. Let us get into it. What we are talking about today is the fireproofing knowledge developed in military dockyards, primarily in the age of sail. These are techniques that were proven under the worst conditions imaginable, and they translate directly to modern woodworking for anyone who wants fire resistance without toxicity. Once you understand the science behind what these shipwrights were doing, you will wonder why we ever moved away from it. So, let me give you some background on where this knowledge comes from. When I first started pulling on this thread, I expected to find a few scattered references in old books. Instead, I found detailed records from the British Royal Dockyards, places like Deptford, Chatham, and Portsmouth, going back to the 1600s. These were enormous operations. At their peak, the Royal Dockyards employed thousands of shipwrights, and they were building vessels that represented the single largest financial investment the Crown could make. A first-rate ship of the line cost roughly the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in today's money, and the number one threat to that investment, besides the enemy, was fire. Wooden warships were floating tinderboxes. You had tar-soaked rigging, pitch-sealed decks, gunpowder magazines, and thousands of board feet of oak packed into a tight hull. One fire ship drifting into your fleet could destroy a dozen vessels in an hour. So the dockyards got extremely serious about fire resistance, and they documented what worked. These were not guessing. They were testing and refining methods over generations. What I found most striking is that their approach was guided by a very practical philosophy. They understood that you cannot make wood truly fireproof. Wood burns. That is its nature. What you can do is raise the temperature at which it ignites, slow the rate at which it combusts, and reduce the flammable gases it releases when it gets hot. And they accomplished all three using naturally occurring minerals, primarily alum and various salts. The Mediterranean navies, the French, the Spanish, the Venetians, they were using similar methods. Even the Scandinavian shipbuilders had their own variations. This was widespread knowledge among anyone who built ships for war. It just never made the jump into civilian woodworking in any lasting way, and that is a real shame because it works. Now, let me walk you through the methods themselves, starting with the one that shows up most often in the dockyard records. The primary treatment was an alum soak. Alum, or potassium aluminum sulfate, is a naturally occurring mineral, salt, that has been mined and traded for thousands of years. You can still buy it today in the spice aisle of most grocery stores. It is used in pickling, in baking powder, in water purification. It is food safe, non-toxic, and it costs almost nothing. Here is what the shipwrights did. They would dissolve alum in warm water at a ratio of roughly 1 pound of alum to 1 gallon of water. The water needed to be warm, around 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, to fully dissolve the crystals. Then they would submerge the timber and let it soak. For thinner stock, say 3/4-inch boards, a 24-hour soak was typical. For heavier timbers, 2 inches and above, they would soak for 3 to 5 days, sometimes longer. Here is why it works, and this is the part that really convinced me. When wood burns, the heat first drives off moisture, then breaks down the cellulose fibers in a process called pyrolysis. That pyrolysis releases flammable gases, and it is those gases that actually catch fire, not the solid wood itself. What alum does is it crystallizes inside the wood fibers as the water evaporates. When heat is applied, those alum crystals release water vapor at relatively low temperatures, well before the wood reaches its ignition point. That water vapor displaces the flammable gases and cools the surface. On top of that, the aluminum compounds form a thin ceramic-like residue on the char layer, which insulates the wood underneath and slows further combustion. I tested this myself with 2 pieces of white oak, each about 3/4 of an inch thick. One was untreated, the other I had soaked in alum solution for 36 hours and then let dry for a week. I held a propane torch to both of them. The untreated piece was fully burning within about 15 seconds. The alum-treated piece charred on the surface, but I held that torch on it for over a minute, and it never produced an open flame. I am not exaggerating. I stood there in my shop watching it, and I thought, why does nobody know about this? The second method is saltwater saturation, and this one has an elegant simplicity to it. Every wooden warship spent its life immersed in seawater, and the shipwrights noticed early on that timbers salvaged from old ships were significantly more fire-resistant than fresh-cut lumber. That was not a coincidence. Seawater contains roughly 3.5% dissolved salts, primarily sodium chloride, but also magnesium salts, calcium salts, and potassium salts. Over months and years, those salts penetrate deep into the wood grain and crystallize within the fibers. The mechanism is similar to alum, but works through a slightly different pathway. When salt-saturated wood is heated, the salt crystals absorb thermal energy as they undergo phase changes. This raises the effective ignition temperature of the wood by anywhere from 50 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on salt concentration and wood species. The sodium chloride also produces a smothering effect, releasing sodium carbonate compounds during combustion that inhibit flame propagation. The dockyards formalized this by creating salt brine soaking tanks. They would mix roughly 2.5 to 3 pounds of sea salt per gallon of water, heat it to dissolve completely, and soak timbers for extended periods. For critical components like magazine walls and bulkheads near the galley stove, the soak times could stretch to 2 weeks or longer. Oak and elm were the most commonly treated species, as they were the primary shipbuilding timbers, but the treatment works on most domestic hardwoods and even softwoods like pine and fir. The salt penetration in softwoods is actually faster due to the more open grain structure, though the total fire resistance is somewhat lower because softwoods have higher resin content. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real, hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now, once I understood how alum and salt each work independently, the next thing I discovered is that the most experienced shipwrights combined them. This was not a casual discovery on their part. Dockyard records from the 1700s describe specific formulations that blended alum and salt into a single mineral bath. The typical recipe called for roughly 3/4 of a pound of alum and 3/4 of a pound of sea salt per gallon of warm water. Some records mention adding a small amount of borax, maybe 2 ounces per gallon, though borax was more expensive and harder to source, so it was reserved for the most critical applications. The combined solution works better than either ingredient alone because the two minerals protect the wood through complementary mechanisms. The alum provides the water vapor release and ceramic char layer. The salt provides the thermal energy absorption and flame suppression. Together, they raise the effective ignition temperature even further and create a more durable barrier against sustained heat exposure. I made up a batch of this combined solution and treated some pine shelving with it, the same kind of common white pine you would buy at any lumber yard. After drying for 10 days, I tested it alongside untreated pine from the same board. The difference was dramatic. The untreated pine caught fire almost immediately under a torch. The treated pine resisted open flame for well over 2 minutes and self-extinguished within seconds of removing the heat source. On pine. That impressed me more than anything else because pine is one of the most flammable, common woods due to its resin content. The fourth method I came across is a surface application rather than a deep soak. and this was used for situations where you could not submerge the timber. The shipwrights would mix alum with vinegar, typically white wine vinegar or cider vinegar, to create a thick paste. The ratio was roughly 2 parts alum powder to 1 part vinegar by volume, mixed until it formed a consistency like thin porridge. They would brush this onto finished surfaces in 2 or 3 coats, allowing each coat to dry thoroughly before applying the next. The vinegar serves 2 purposes. First, the acetic acid helps dissolve the alum into a finer, more penetrative solution than water alone. Second, the acid slightly opens the wood grain on the surface, allowing the alum to penetrate the first 1/8 inch or so, even on finished or aged wood. This method does not provide the deep protection of a full soak, but it adds meaningful surface fire resistance to existing structures, furniture, or panels that cannot be disassembled and submerged. I used this on the underside of a workbench top that sits near my wood stove. 3 coats over 2 days. Once it dried, I could not see any difference in the wood surface, no discoloration, no residue. But the peace of mind is real. The 5th method is the one nobody wants to talk about, but I would not be honest with you if I left it out. Historical records from multiple navies describe the use of aged urine brine as a fire retardant treatment. I know. But hear me out. Aged urine, when left to ferment for several weeks, converts to a solution rich in ammonium salts, primarily ammonium carbonate and ammonium phosphate. These are, in fact, the same active compounds found in many modern commercial fire retardants, just produced through a biological process rather than an industrial one. The shipwrights and dockyard workers would collect urine in barrels, allow it to age for 4 to 6 weeks, and then use it either as a soak or a brush-on treatment. The ammonia compounds work by releasing non-flammable gases during heating that dilute and displace the flammable pyrolysis gases coming off the wood. Now, I am not suggesting you start collecting urine in your shop, but I mention this because it tells you something important about the underlying chemistry. The compounds that make wood fire resistant are not exotic. They are simple nitrogen and phosphorus salts that occur naturally and have been available to craftsmen for centuries. If you want the same chemistry without the historical method, you can dissolve ammonium phosphate, which is sold as monoammonium phosphate fertilizer at any garden center at a ratio of about 1 pound per gallon of water, and use it exactly the same way. The 6th method is one you might have heard of in a different context: controlled surface charring. The Japanese call it shosugi ban, and it has become trendy in modern architecture, but naval shipwrights were doing the same thing centuries before it got a design magazine feature. They would take a torch or a fire pit and deliberately char the outer surface of hull planks, deck boards, and structural timbers to a depth of about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. Here is the science. When you char wood, you are converting the outer layer of cellulose into carbon. Pure carbon does not release flammable gases the way raw cellulose does. It acts as an insulating barrier that protects the unburned wood beneath. The char layer also becomes hydrophobic, meaning it repels water, which provides the secondary benefit of rot resistance. The shipwrights would char the timber, then brush off the loose soot, and often apply one of the mineral treatments on top of the charred surface for layered protection. I have used this technique on fence posts and outdoor furniture, and I can confirm it works beautifully. The key is controlling the burn depth. You want a solid, alligator-textured char, not a light toasting. And that brings me to the 7th method, which is really the capstone of everything else. The most protected components on a warship received layered treatment. The shipwrights did not rely on a single method. They would char the surface, then soak the timber in a combined alum and salt bath, then apply a vinegar and alum paste to any end grain or joints where penetration might be limited. The magazine walls on a ship of the line, where the gunpowder was stored, sometimes received all of these treatments, plus an additional lining of lead sheet or wetted felt. They understood that fire resistance is cumulative. Each layer adds protection, and the combination is far more effective than any single method alone. For home shop applications, I would recommend starting with the combined alum and salt soak for any new project where fire resistance matters. If you are treating existing furniture or structures, the vinegar and alum paste is your best option. And for outdoor projects, add a charred surface layer underneath the mineral treatment. You do not need to do everything the shipwrights did, but even one of these methods will give you more fire resistance than untreated wood without a single toxic chemical. Now, let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for commercial fire retardant spray as the default. Most of us do this because it is convenient and it is marketed heavily, but most spray-on retardants contain formaldehyde carriers, halogenated compounds, or ammonium salts dissolved in volatile organic solvents. They work, but they off-gas for weeks. They can irritate your lungs, and they break down under UV exposure within a few years. The Naval approach uses the same active chemistry, mineral salts, but delivers them in water with no volatile carriers and no degradation timeline. The second pattern is assuming pressure-treated lumber is fire-resistant. It is not. Pressure treatment with copper azole or alkaline copper quaternary is designed for rot and insect resistance. It does almost nothing for fire. I made this assumption for years before I actually tested it. The third pattern is dismissing natural treatments as primitive or unreliable. I was guilty of this. I figured if it came from the 1700s, it could not possibly compete with modern chemistry. But the underlying science is identical. Alum and salt work through the same mechanisms that commercial fire retardants use. The old shipwrights just discovered them empirically instead of in a laboratory. The fourth pattern is treating fire resistance as all or nothing. Most of us either ignore it entirely or try to make something completely fireproof, which is impossible with wood. The Naval tradition teaches you to think in terms of delay and resistance. You are buying time, raising the ignition temperature, slowing the burn rate, and giving yourself or your family extra minutes in an emergency. That mindset shift matters more than any single technique. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a simple test I learned for checking whether an alum treatment has actually penetrated deep enough to be effective. After your treated wood has dried completely, take a sharp chisel and pare off a thin shaving from the surface, maybe 1/16 of an inch deep. Then hold a match to that shaving. If the treatment has penetrated properly, the shaving will curl and char, but will not sustain a flame on its own. It will self-extinguish within 2 to 3 seconds of removing the match. If it catches fire and keeps burning, your soak time was not long enough, or your solution was too dilute. Go back and retreat. I do this test on every batch now. It takes 30 seconds and gives you real confidence that the treatment worked. No guessing, no hoping. Just a simple, honest test that tells you exactly where you stand. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries, the kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now, or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Listen, I have been woodworking for a long time, and I am still amazed at how much practical knowledge is sitting in historical records that most of us never encounter. These naval fireproofing methods are real, they are tested, and they use materials you can pick up on your next grocery run. Alum, salt, vinegar, and a little patience. That is all it takes to give your projects a level of fire resistance that would have protected a warship. Try one of these methods on your next build. I think you will be surprised at how well it works. Thanks for sticking with me today, and I will see you on the next one.